It was a peaceful night, the kind where everyone thought they were safe in their homes. But little did anyone know, something tragic was about to unfold. Rebecca, a woman in her early 30s, was dealing with a storm brewing inside her heart. She'd recently discovered a painful truth: her husband, Michael, had been seeing another woman, Jessica. This wasn't just a casual affair, it was something that had been tearing Rebecca apart in silence. One night, Rebecca couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She confronted Michael about the affair, and as the truth spilled out, so did her anger and hurt. Desperate for answers, she went out to find Jessica. The two women met face to face in a tense, heated confrontation. What started as a painful exchange quickly spiraled out of control, leading to a shocking turn that no one could have expected. When police arrived on the scene, they were met with chaos. Michael's mistress, Jessica, was found dead, and Rebecca, the once devoted wife, was at the center of it all. Was this a crime born out of jealousy, a moment of blind rage, or something deeper? Detective Samuels, a seasoned investigator, took charge, trying to piece together what happened that fateful night. The case quickly caught the public's attention, and people everywhere were left wondering what drove Rebecca to take such a drastic step. Friends and family spoke of her kindness and gentle nature, making it hard to believe she'd be capable of something like this. This is the story of a woman pushed to her breaking point, a tragic love triangle, and the night that changed everything. Stay with us as we unravel the details, shedding light on how one fateful moment could lead to such a heartbreaking end. Rebecca's story began on a seemingly ordinary night, one of those quiet evenings when the world around her seemed still. But inside, Rebecca's heart was anything but calm. She had discovered something that changed everything about her marriage to Michael. It wasn't just suspicion or whispers, it was a painful truth she could no longer ignore. Her husband, Michael, had been unfaithful. The other woman's name was Jessica, and this wasn't just a brief affair. It was something that had shaken Rebecca to her core, filling her with a mix of betrayal and rage. Rebecca had been married to Michael for nearly 10 years. They had met in college, and their relationship had always seemed strong. They built a life together, sharing hopes, dreams, and plans for the future. Friends and family saw them as a happy couple. To the outside world, they had it all: stability, a good home, and a life that many people envied. But now, Rebecca's discovery of Michael's affair tore through her, making her question every moment they'd shared. Days turned into sleepless nights as Rebecca tried to process what she had found out. She thought about confronting Michael, demanding answers, and maybe even trying to understand why he had done this. But as she thought more about Jessica, the woman Michael had chosen to betray her with, her feelings shifted from sorrow to anger. It wasn't just the affair itself, it was the fact that Michael had chosen someone else over her, someone who had quietly entered their lives and broken the trust Rebecca held dear. Rebecca couldn't shake the images in her mind. She imagined the moments Michael had shared with Jessica, the secrets they kept from her. The betrayal felt like a wound that wouldn't heal. As days passed, she couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She decided it was time to confront both Michael and Jessica, to face the truth head-on. One night, Rebecca waited for Michael to come home, intending to confront him about the affair. When he finally arrived, tired and carrying the weight of his own secrets, Rebecca didn't hold back. She asked him directly about Jessica, about the affair, and about everything he had hidden from her. At first, Michael tried to deny it, avoiding her gaze and shifting in his seat, but eventually he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer. Michael confessed, confirming Rebecca's worst fears. The shock of his admission left Rebecca feeling both numb and enraged, her mind spinning as she tried to process his words. But this confession wasn't enough for her. She needed to hear Jessica's side. In her mind, Jessica was just as much to blame as Michael, if not more. So Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She found Jessica's address and decided to confront her face to face, to ask her why she had done this, to understand what could make someone come between a husband and wife. Rebecca drove to Jessica's house, her mind filled with anger, hurt, and a need for closure. When she arrived, Jessica seemed surprised to see her but opened the door. There they stood, two women connected by a betrayal, each seeing a different version of Michael in their minds. The air was thick with tension as Rebecca began to question Jessica. She wanted to understand, but with every word Jessica spoke, her anger grew. Jessica tried to explain, but Rebecca couldn't see past the pain. The confrontation quickly spiraled out of control. Voices were raised, and emotions that had been held in check for so long finally burst forth. What started as a painful exchange of words became something more intense, something darker. In a moment of blind rage and desperation, the confrontation turned physical. Rebecca, driven by a mix of betrayal, hurt, and anger, lost control. the night took a tragic turn that no one could have foreseen. By the time the police arrived, the situation had escalated beyond anything anyone could imagine. Jessica lay still, and Rebecca, overwhelmed and shocked by what had happened, was left alone to face the aftermath. It wasn't supposed to end like this. She had only wanted answers, to understand why her husband had betrayed her. But now, there was no going back. The choices made in that heated moment had set off a chain of events that couldn't be undone. The investigation began as soon as the authorities arrived. Detective Samuels, a seasoned investigator known for his attention to detail, took charge of the case. He found Rebecca at the scene, visibly shaken and struggling to come to terms with what had just happened. She tried to explain herself, but her words came out in fragments, her mind still processing the gravity of the situation. Friends and family were shocked when they heard what had happened. They couldn't believe that the Rebecca they knew, a gentle and caring woman, could be involved in such a tragedy. But as the investigation continued, the reality of the betrayal she had experienced and the emotions it had unleashed became clear. This was a story of love gone wrong, a story of trust shattered and lives forever changed by one fateful night. Detective Samuels knew that this case was unlike any other he had handled. It wasn't just a simple crime, it was a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and the devastating consequences of choices made in moments of extreme emotion. As he pieced together the events leading up to that night, he began to understand the depth of the pain that had driven Rebecca to such a tragic end. But even with all the evidence, one question remained unanswered: what could have been done to prevent such a heartbreaking outcome? After the tragic confrontation, the police moved quickly to secure the scene. The officers found Rebecca sitting near the doorway, visibly shaken, trying to come to grips with what had just happened. Jessica's body lay still, and the weight of the night's events hung heavy in the air. For Rebecca, what had started as a search for answers had turned into a nightmare. As officers carefully approached her, they asked what had led to this tragic end. Rebecca, in a daze, could barely process her own words, speaking in fragments about betrayal, heartbreak, and the intense anger that had clouded her mind. The police began gathering evidence from the scene, taking note of every detail. They noted signs of struggle in Jessica's living room. Overturned furniture, broken glass, and scattered belongings told the story of a confrontation that had escalated beyond control. The detectives on the scene worked meticulously, photographing the area and collecting any possible evidence that could explain what had driven Rebecca to such lengths. Detective Samuels, assigned to lead the investigation, approached the case with caution. He knew that untangling the emotions and events leading to Jessica's death would be challenging. Rebecca was brought to the police station for questioning. Sitting alone in the cold, bright room, she seemed lost, almost numb. The events of the night played back in her mind, but she struggled to put them into words. Detective Samuels entered the room, observing her closely. He saw a woman torn apart by the choices she had made, but he needed to understand exactly what had pushed her to this breaking point. He started the questioning slowly, asking Rebecca to recount the events from the beginning, hoping to piece together a coherent story from the chaotic fragments she offered. Rebecca spoke of her marriage, of the years she had spent with Michael, building a life and trusting him completely. She described how the discovery of Michael's affair had shattered her world, leaving her feeling betrayed and unworthy. As she talked, her voice wavered, as if the emotions were too much to bear. She explained how she had confronted Michael, how his confession had left her empty, and how, in her desperation, she had felt a need to confront Jessica as well. She hadn't planned for things to go this far, but when she saw Jessica, her anger surged, and control slipped from her grasp. Detective Samuels listened carefully, noting the raw pain in Rebecca's voice. He could sense that her actions had not been entirely premeditated, that she had been overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. However, he also knew that Jessica's death required answers. It wasn't enough to simply understand Rebecca's feelings, he needed facts. He asked her to explain the confrontation in more detail, hoping to get a clearer picture of what had led to Jessica's tragic end. Rebecca recalled her arrival at Jessica's home, the tense moment when they stood face to face, each woman silently accusing the other. Rebecca's mind replayed the argument that followed, the words that cut like knives, the accusations, the insults. She spoke of how Jessica had tried to explain herself, but Rebecca couldn't see past her own pain. She felt trapped in her anger, and in a moment of lost control, things turned physical. The struggle that ensued was a blur of movement, of fear and fury combined, until, in a tragic instant, Jessica lay motionless, and Rebecca realized the full weight of what she had done. Detective Samuels took Rebecca's statement, and returned to his office to review the evidence. He knew he had to approach the case from all angles, piecing together not only the events of the confrontation but the context surrounding it. He studied Rebecca's account carefully, comparing it to the evidence gathered at the scene. The broken glass, the overturned furniture, and the signs of struggle painted a picture of a desperate, heated exchange. However, he needed to confirm Rebecca's story, to see if her actions had been truly impulsive, or if there had been any sign of intent leading up to that night. To further understand the situation, Detective Samuels began speaking with those who knew Rebecca and Michael. Friends, neighbors, and family members provided insight into their marriage. Many described Rebecca as a devoted wife, a kind-hearted woman who would have done anything for her husband. The revelation of Michael's affair, they said, had been shocking. No one had expected such betrayal. Some friends mentioned how the discovery had changed Rebecca, how she had become withdrawn, struggling to make sense of her world after learning of her husband's infidelity. At the same time, Detective Samuels looked into Jessica's life. He spoke with her friends and family, piecing together who she was beyond the affair. Jessica was described as a woman who had made mistakes, but who had never intended to hurt anyone. Her loved ones painted a picture of someone who had been caught in a complicated situation, possibly thinking that Michael's marriage was coming to an end. The detective began to see that both women had been affected by Michael's actions, each of them dealing with the consequences of his betrayal in different ways. As the investigation continued, Detective Samuels faced the difficult task of determining whether Rebecca's actions were a crime of passion or something darker. He reviewed evidence of text messages and calls between Michael and Jessica, hoping to find any indication of what had driven Rebecca to confront her. He found messages revealing the depth of the affair, the promises Michael had made to Jessica, and the lies he had told both women. It was clear that Rebecca had discovered not only the affair but the many ways in which she had been deceived by the man she had trusted. With each piece of evidence, Detective Samuels drew closer to understanding the complex web of emotions that had led to that fateful night. He saw how the betrayal, the anger, and the heartbreak had collided in a single, tragic moment, pushing Rebecca beyond her breaking point. However, understanding the emotional weight of the case was only one part of his job. He still needed to build a legal case, to present the facts in a way that would give clarity to a jury. The question remained whether Rebecca's actions would be seen as a spontaneous, tragic mistake or as something requiring full accountability. As the investigation continued, Detective Samuels and his team began to look deeper into Rebecca's life and her interactions with Michael and Jessica in the days leading up to the tragic night. They collected text messages, phone records, and testimonies from close friends and family, piecing together the events that had led Rebecca to confront Jessica. Each new detail added layers to Rebecca's story, revealing just how deeply she had been affected by Michael's betrayal and how her emotions had spiraled as she uncovered more about his affair. Friends of Rebecca described her as a loving and devoted wife. For years, she had dedicated herself to her marriage and believed in Michael wholeheartedly. When she discovered his infidelity, it shook her to her core. She had confronted Michael, and his confession had left her feeling lost and devastated. He had not only admitted to the affair but had told her that he had feelings for Jessica. For Rebecca, these words cut deeply, leaving her with a sense of betrayal that would be hard for anyone to understand. She felt as though her entire life had been a lie, and she struggled to cope with the reality of Michael's unfaithfulness. As Rebecca grappled with her emotions, she found herself unable to sleep or eat properly. Her mind kept returning to Jessica, the woman she saw as the source of her pain. Rebecca's friends noticed her change, observing how she had become distant, withdrawn, and filled with anger. Some had tried to console her, but nothing seemed to help. In the days leading up to her confrontation with Jessica, Rebecca's frustration grew, and her feelings became too overwhelming to contain. She told a close friend that she wanted to confront Jessica to find closure, to understand why Jessica had come between her and Michael. Detective Samuels carefully reviewed these testimonies, noting the mounting pressure Rebecca had been under. The investigation revealed that Rebecca's decision to confront Jessica was not sudden, it had been building up over time. The detectives found messages Rebecca had sent to friends, expressing her confusion and anger. She had mentioned how betrayed she felt, how she couldn't believe that someone she loved so deeply had hurt her in such a way. These messages provided a glimpse into Rebecca's mental state, showing just how much the affair had affected her. The day Rebecca decided to confront Jessica, she had driven to Jessica's house in a state of emotional turmoil. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, prepared to let out all the feelings that had been consuming her. However, when she stood face to face with Jessica, The emotion she had tried to contain came rushing to the surface. The conversation started tense, with Rebecca demanding answers, wanting to know why Jessica had interfered in her marriage. Jessica, taken aback, tried to explain herself, but the tension between them only escalated. As the confrontation intensified, Rebecca's anger overcame her. The argument that had begun with words turned into a physical struggle. Detectives discovered bruises on Rebecca's arms from the altercation, which suggested a violent struggle had taken place between the two women. Witnesses nearby had reported hearing raised voices and sounds of objects breaking. The confrontation had quickly spiraled out of control, leading to the tragic outcome that left Jessica dead and Rebecca reeling from her actions. The detectives continued to gather evidence, hoping to understand whether Rebecca's actions had been an impulsive reaction or if there had been any signs of premeditation. The messages, the testimonies from friends, and the physical evidence painted a complex picture. Detective Samuels reviewed each piece, noting how the intensity of Rebecca's emotions had built up over time. It seemed clear that she had not intended for things to end this way, but the overwhelming grief and betrayal had pushed her to act without thinking. In reviewing Rebecca's police statement, Detective Samuels noted her regret and confusion about what had happened. She had not planned to take a life, she had only wanted to find answers, to confront the woman she saw as the cause of her pain. But in that heated moment, her emotions had overpowered her judgment. The tragic confrontation was not the result of a well-thought-out plan, it was an outburst that had ended in the worst possible way. Detective Samuels and his team now had to determine if the legal system would view Rebecca's actions as a crime of passion or something more severe. As the case developed, the media began covering the story, drawing public attention to Rebecca, Michael, and Jessica. People were divided in their opinions. Some saw Rebecca as a victim of betrayal, pushed to her limit by the pain of her husband's actions. Others viewed her as someone who had gone too far, unable to control her emotions, resulting in a tragic and irreversible act. The public scrutiny added pressure to the investigation, with people wanting justice for Jessica, while also sympathizing with Rebecca's heartache. Detective Samuels continued his work, determined to present the facts accurately. He knew that emotions could cloud judgment, both in Rebecca's actions and in how the public viewed the case. As he analyzed the evidence and testimonies, he could see the weight of betrayal that Rebecca had carried, the desperation that had built up inside her. But he also recognized that a life had been lost, and that justice had to be served. The detectives prepared to take the case to court, gathering everything they had learned about the night of the confrontation. They knew that presenting the story would be challenging, as it was filled with raw emotion and painful truths. Rebecca's heartbreak, Jessica's unexpected death, and Michael's role in the affair all formed a tangled web that would soon be laid out for a judge and jury to decide. Detective Samuels could only hope that the truth, however painful, would bring some sense of closure to everyone affected. As the case neared the courtroom, the story of Rebecca, Michael, and Jessica had become the center of public attention. Every detail of their lives was now being examined by the media, the legal teams, and the community. People discussed the case in cafes, at work, and on the streets, each person having their own opinion. Some people saw Rebecca as a victim, a woman pushed too far by betrayal and heartbreak. Others felt that no amount of emotional pain could justify what had happened to Jessica. Detective Samuels and the legal team worked tirelessly to prepare the evidence. They reviewed the testimonies from Rebecca's friends and family, her text messages, and the physical evidence from the night of the confrontation. The prosecution aimed to present Rebecca as someone who, in a moment of intense anger, had acted without regard for the consequences. They wanted the jury to see that while her emotions were understandable, her actions were not excusable. They carefully pieced together a timeline of events, showing how Rebecca's hurt and betrayal had built up over time, finally erupting on the night of Jessica's death. On the other side, Rebecca's defense team focused on the emotional turmoil she had experienced. They argued that her actions were not premeditated, but rather a response to an overwhelming situation. They emphasized the years she had dedicated to her marriage, the trust she had placed in Michael, and the devastation she felt upon discovering his affair. They wanted the jury to see her as a woman pushed beyond her breaking point, someone who had acted out of pain rather than malice. They pointed to her clean record, her kind nature, and the deep remorse she had shown since the incident. When the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. Journalists, friends, family, and members of the public gathered, all eager to hear the details that would finally bring some clarity to the tragic event. Rebecca sat quietly, looking visibly affected by the weight of what had happened. Michael was also present, his expression somber, as he too faced the reality of his choices and their devastating consequences. The prosecution opened by detailing the timeline of events, starting from the moment Rebecca had discovered the affair. They presented the evidence carefully, drawing attention to the emotional messages Rebecca had sent to her friends, expressing her hurt and anger. The prosecutor explained how these messages showed her mental state leading up to the confrontation with Jessica. They argued that while Rebecca's feelings of betrayal were understandable, they did not excuse her actions. The prosecution emphasized that Jessica had lost her life, and justice needed to be served. Rebecca's defense team countered by describing her as a deeply hurt woman who had acted in a moment of despair. They acknowledged the tragedy but focused on the mental strain Rebecca had been under. They spoke about the betrayal she had faced, the emotional breakdown that had followed, and the way her life had unraveled upon discovering Michael's affair. They argued that her actions were not planned but rather a result of the intense emotional pain she had experienced. They asked the jury to consider her state of mind and her intention, suggesting that she had not set out to harm Jessica but had been overcome by her emotions in the heat of the moment. Throughout the trial, witnesses were called to testify. Friends and family members spoke about Rebecca's character, her love for Michael, and her shock when she learned of the affair. They described her as a caring woman who had always put her family first, someone who had been devastated by the betrayal. They spoke about her change in behavior after the discovery, noting how she had withdrawn, lost weight, and struggled to cope. These testimonies helped the jury understand the depth of her pain and the toll the situation had taken on her. Jessica's friends and family also testified, sharing their memories of her and the shock they felt at her tragic death. They described Jessica as a complex person who had made mistakes but had not deserved to die. They expressed their grief and anger, hoping that the court would hold Rebecca accountable. Their testimonies added a painful human element to the trial, reminding everyone of the life that had been lost and the grief that her loved ones were now forced to bear. As the trial continued, the prosecution presented the physical evidence from the night of the confrontation. They described the scene of the crime, the struggle, and the evidence of a violent altercation. The prosecution argued that Rebecca's actions had gone beyond a momentary lapse, showing the jury that Jessica's death had been the result of a brutal fight. They wanted the jury to see that while Rebecca's emotions were strong, they could not justify the tragic outcome. Rebecca's defense team responded by pointing out the signs of struggle on Rebecca herself, the bruises and injuries that showed she had not been in control of the situation. They argued that Jessica's death had not been Rebecca's intention, that she had gone to confront her, but had been overwhelmed by her own feelings. They asked the jury to consider Rebecca's background, her life before the incident, and the emotional distress she had endured, painting her as a woman who had acted impulsively in a moment of unbearable pain. The courtroom grew tense as each side presented their arguments, each person hanging on every word, waiting for the moment when the truth would become clear. The jury watched closely, absorbing the details, the testimonies, and the evidence, trying to make sense of a tragedy that seemed beyond simple explanation. They listened as both sides argued passionately, weighing the facts against the emotions that had driven Rebecca to that fateful night. As the trial neared its end, it became clear that the decision would not be easy. The jurors would have to consider Rebecca's pain, the betrayal she had felt, and the life that had been lost. They would have to decide if her actions were the result of a woman pushed too far, or if she had crossed a line that could not be excused. The weight of the case pressed on everyone present, knowing that soon, the jury would deliver a verdict that would forever change the lives of those involved. The story of Rebecca, Michael, and Jessica was drawing to a close, but its impact would remain, leaving behind a lesson of heartbreak, betrayal, and the tragic consequences of one irreversible choice. The jury listened closely as the trial neared its end, feeling the weight of the decision they would soon have to make. Both sides had presented their cases with detail and passion, and the courtroom was silent as they processed the story that had been laid out before them. The final statements from the prosecution and the defense reminded everyone of what had been lost and of the complex emotions and choices that had led to the tragic death of Jessica. In a case filled with raw emotion, betrayal, and heartbreak, the jury would have to determine Rebecca's fate. The judge read the instructions to the jury, explaining the legal definitions and guiding them on how to consider Rebecca's state of mind and intent. The jurors were told to focus on whether Rebecca's actions were premeditated or if they were the result of a sudden, uncontrollable reaction to her circumstances. They were reminded that they must weigh the evidence carefully, separating their personal feelings from the facts. As the judge finished, the jurors were led to the deliberation room. where they would discuss everything they had seen and heard in the past days. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors began by reviewing the timeline of events and the testimonies they had heard. They discussed the emotional impact of Rebecca's discovery of Michael's affair and how her behavior had changed leading up to the confrontation with Jessica. They considered the messages Rebecca had sent to her friends, the physical evidence of the struggle, and the testimonies of friends and family who had witnessed Rebecca's distress. The jury discussed whether her actions were truly spontaneous or if there had been any indication that she had planned to confront Jessica with violent intentions. As they continued to deliberate, some jurors felt sympathetic toward Rebecca. They believed that her actions were a response to intense emotional pain and betrayal. They argued that she had been pushed to her limit, that her world had fallen apart when she discovered Michael's infidelity, and that the confrontation with Jessica had been the breaking point. These jurors felt that Rebecca had acted impulsively, that her actions were not premeditated, but rather an outburst in a moment of deep despair. Other jurors took a different view, feeling that regardless of Rebecca's emotions, a life had been lost and justice needed to be served. They argued that her anger had led to an irreversible tragedy, and that even if she hadn't planned the outcome, her actions had crossed a line. They pointed out the brutality of the struggle, the signs of escalation, and the choices she had made in going to Jessica's home. These jurors believed that while Rebecca's pain was real, it could not excuse the consequences of her actions. The discussion in the jury room grew intense, with each side presenting their perspective and trying to reach an agreement. The jurors debated whether Rebecca's actions fell under the definition of a crime of passion, or if her behavior suggested something more deliberate. They considered the guidance from the judge, discussing whether Rebecca's mental state at the time allowed for any leniency, or if the nature of the crime required a strict verdict. They went back and forth, each side trying to make sense of a situation that defied easy explanation. Hours passed as the jury continued their deliberations, reviewing evidence, testimonies, and the conflicting emotions that the case had stirred in each of them. They revisited details of the confrontation, weighing the testimonies of Rebecca's friends and family, and the prosecution's presentation of her actions. It became clear that this was not a simple case of guilt or innocence. It was a story filled with pain, loss, and the tragic results of a single heated moment that had spiraled out of control. Finally, the jury came to a decision. They signaled to the judge that they were ready, and the tension in the courtroom grew as everyone prepared to hear the verdict. Rebecca sat with her hands folded, her face showing the strain of the trial, while her lawyer placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Michael, seated behind her, looked on, visibly affected by the events that his actions had set in motion. As the judge asked the jury foreperson to read the verdict, silence fell over the room. The jury had found Rebecca guilty of involuntary manslaughter, a decision that reflected both the emotional nature of her actions and the tragic consequences that had resulted. The courtroom remained silent as the judge acknowledged the verdict and explained the sentencing guidelines. Rebecca would serve a reduced sentence, with mandatory counseling and probation once released, an outcome that recognized her remorse and the complex factors that had led to Jessica's death. Rebecca's face showed a mixture of relief and sorrow as she absorbed the verdict. She had lost much her marriage, her freedom, and the life she once knew. Yet the outcome also offered her a path forward, a chance to eventually rebuild and confront the consequences of that fateful night. Michael, too, bore the weight of what had happened, realizing that his actions had not only destroyed his marriage but had led to a tragedy that no one could undo. As the courtroom emptied, the emotions lingered, each person affected in different ways by the story that had unfolded before them. For Rebecca, life would never be the same. The sentence marked the beginning of a journey toward healing, one that would take time and effort. Her memories of that night, the pain of betrayal, and the moment she lost control would remain with her forever. She had been judged for her actions, yet the deeper scars, the emotional wounds left by the betrayal and loss, would take years to fully heal. The community moved on, though the story of Rebecca, Michael, and Jessica remained a reminder of the consequences of choices and the fragility of trust. People continued to talk about the case for a while, each person reflecting on the events and drawing their own conclusions. The tragedy served as a painful lesson in how quickly life can change, how a single decision can alter everything, and how sometimes even the most well-intentioned people can find themselves caught in the aftermath of choices made in moments of extreme emotion. Rebecca's story came to an end in the courtroom that day, but the impact of her actions would be felt long after.